I'll be talking about Silicon Valley investing, but you see from my name, the pronunciation Bedy, that's not an American name. This is me. My parents are immigrants. They moved first to Paraguay. I grew up at the border city. And the story I really want to bring is when you come to Silicon Valley, actually, a lot of people that are there, they're actually not from there. It's such an open community that allowed me to really join. So today, I'm part of 500 startups. I joined 500 about 6 years ago. And we have a very peculiar culture, as you can see. This picture is from our last demo day, where companies present and pitch after we have invested in them. I joined when we had the second batch. The way we operate at the accelerator with the seed program level is 30 to 50 companies come, and then they join our program. At the time, one thing that really struck me at the organization, these two companies you might have seen yesterday, 9gag, it's one of them. Another company is Peak Collage. I stepped into the office in Silicon Valley, that was in Mountain View, our first office. I saw these two startups that weren't actually from Silicon Valley. One was from Hong Kong, another was from Taiwan. And it really struck me, like this organization that would be willing to pioneer and start working with companies that could come from really anywhere. I really put my heart to say, this is the place where I feel like I can also make the difference. So really quickly, right after, I was able to help source some of the companies and work with some of the companies. And this was when it was sort of already next batch. And some of our successful companies today in the portfolio, although say it's Silicon Valley, they're actually like founders from around the world. So TalkDesk, it's a company where both co-founders are from Portugal, and Conta Azul. The founders are actually from Joinville. So you might think like, oh, maybe they're from Brazil, and they might be from a big city. No, they're from Joinville. Just like me, I'm from Foz do Iguaçu, a city you probably might have or might not have heard of. So the beauty of when I look at what we're creating often in this environment, Silicon Valley, is such an sort of open place where it welcomes people to come in. It doesn't really matter who you are. It really matters where you're going. So the vision of having the decentralization and being like going global from 500 startup really helped me set my heart and my head into this organization. Since I joined in 6 years, I was doing many of the first international investments. So the previous panel was about Africa. I did source the first Africa deal in, the first Russia deal in, of course, the first Brazilian deal in. But today, we have, fortunately, 150 people on staff, and more a structure with the dedicated fund where you have sort of local fund managers sort of investing. And in terms of size, we are 300 million under management and in 60 countries. So that sort of early part of 500 that I was part of, where we were maybe thinking, that's so great, like these 10 countries, we can invest in all those places. Today, we're in 60. And what I wanted to share is the 3 lessons, actually, as an early employee. I joined when it was like 7 of us, including an intern. It's the lesson that I learned sort of being in Silicon Valley, but not from there, and how we continue to be a startup. The first thing, people talk a lot about Silicon Valley, I think sort of repeat sort of topic, it's on fail. But what I want to sort of emphasize on failing is that it's not like fail often, failing is fine. What I want to emphasize here is think of it as a budget. You have how many like times you can fail until you succeed, right? You just need to like find enough runway that you can find that sort of successful moment. So I'll talk a little bit about like the experiments we run internally at 500. Some of them clearly are successful, some of them are failure that I was sort of running and involved. But the budgeting of the factor for the failure is really important because that's just pure risk appetite. So if we dive a layer deeper, you look at our failure rate. Like people say like, oh, what's the failure rate in early stage companies, right? So these are aggregate data that we put together on the first 2 funds we have. It's around 600 companies. So you look at 577 CO means like almost like 600 companies. Those are the companies we put money in on Fund 1 and Fund 2, and they are like early stage. Only 25% of them actually move to the next level. So if you think about like, if only like a fourth, like 1 out of 4, right, move to the next stage, if I only invest in 3 companies, probably I would have not even moved to Series A, right? So I'm not budgeting, like if I want the success, and the success I want is actually 2%. I want companies to be beyond 500 million. I want the $1 billion company, right? But it's only 2%. So if the failure rate is so high, can I allow myself only to do investments in 10 companies? If it's only 10 companies, 2%, actually half companies, not 1 company. So a lot of the reason that we have such a big portfolio, 100 companies per fund normally, is because we have to account for the failure rate. Only about 10% of our companies are successful. And we know that, so it's okay. So I want to talk a little about, this is just from investment perspective, and I think that's sort of a mindset that is important to put. It's like, what's your risk appetite, right? And based on that, like there's one like law in the startup world is that majority of them are going to fail in early stage. So our experiments, this is us looking super nice. Oops. So this is one experiment we actually run. When I joined management team, we got to pick sort of few projects. I actually picked for us to run a syndicate on, I don't know where it says, in a very important platform. And then I launched 2. I launched a 500 syndicate general, and I launched the sort of women's syndicate. And I was really excited about that. And it was sort of running through a little bit of the detail why it didn't work. It was because we were investing in such a high volume, right? Like every quarter we have 50 companies sort of graduating. And then of those 50 companies, it was so hard for me to choose which one to put on the syndicate to put. So every time I decided one company to put every month, I'm making a conscious decision where it's sort of biased to our investors. So at the beginning, we realized it wasn't really working, at least sort of plug into our model. Another sort of interesting experiment, I would say, like, why don't we do like a women's syndicate and see what's gonna work? Like you can see a little bit of the amount, those are recent when I pull it out. If you understand how the syndicate works, it's like people say, oh, I'm gonna sort of back. So the main syndicate, you have about 4.5 million, and the women's syndicate only about 250K. But the conversion rate actually of people who are in the women's syndicate was pretty high. So even if it's only 250,000 sort of equivalent to amount that people are interested to put in, actually majority of them ended up converting. So it's just like the intention of investing a lot higher. But the challenge really there is, it was ultimately the reason we stopped running the women at all is that it was a lot better to use the same platform and say, this is a women founder, but let's leverage a 4.5 million than to recruit separately. That was sort of the first sort of mistake we sort of learned. And the second is, when we're recruiting the syndicate backers, that was almost like raising a fund. If it's like raising a fund, I might as well just raise a fund, right? So this was something that it didn't work. Of course, there's also a lot of arguments it didn't work. it's depending who the founder of this initiative is. So now that we're doing more vertical funds at 500 startups, we are going to start testing and see how syndicates work for us, at least in sort of open platforms. But some of them, experiments, actually make me feel very proud. And this is a program that I launched 2 years ago with Stanford University, where when we think 500 as a platform, I wanted to really open everything I have learned after done 100 investments into a startup to say, how can I take that mindset? How can I take that methodology to other investors, right? So we launched Venture Capital Unlocked. At the time, it was called Insight to Silicon Valley Investing. And also on the same note, we launched the Diversity Scholarship. And you can see sort of a common sort of theme here where I feel like it doesn't matter what we do, or it doesn't matter what I do, whether it's with 500, anything in the future, any initiative I'll be running, the diversity component is really important. So the program, when we launched, it was really successful in terms of people applying to want to join. Of course, sort of a joint program where we're sharing knowledge with, in practice, 500 startups with Stanford. I got around 50 applications for people wanting to attend, and I had only 1 woman in that group. And I was really struggling at the time because I was like, I need to, on one hand, make something grow, but at the same time, I'm trying to solve an additional thing, which is I want women investors in this class, right? Because I feel like if we start something with such a small percentage, let's say I have only 1 woman in the class, I'm creating a future debt that is going to be so hard for me to catch up. It's a catch-up game. If you start with 50-50, if you lose a little bit of ground, 5%, 10%, you can catch up after. But if you start with like 5%, you have to move to 50%, it's just so hard. So I said, I will not launch this program. I don't care how successful it would be in terms of the result. I will not launch this without at least a certain percentage of having sort of women in our class. So we ended up sort of very quickly launching the scholarship, and the first program actually had, today we've been doing like 10 programs so far with different universities. We've been sort of keeping the percentage at around 30%. I'd like to continue to increase and think how we increase the diversity. But I feel like that's an experiment that we did. It was very audacious because it was only like 2 months for us to launch a program with an institution that normally takes a year for them to take decision. And most people who was advising me at the time say, why don't you launch something really successful and then you think about diversity? I said, if I launch something successful that doesn't have the diversity component, I feel like that is not a success. So defining that success was really important for me early on. So when you run experiments, you actually have to, I'm back on my first point on failure. You should be able to run as many as possible, just don't run out of money. Second thing I learned, scale matters. So my first deal I did with 500 startups was a company called Viva Real. It's a real estate online platform in Brazil. Of course, they were quite small when we invested. It was early stage, and today they're the largest platform in Brazil. You would even see, like when you started, we even have an old logo, like when I was looking at it, and it has this funny thing calling like blowing up startups since 2010. So that's when we started. But if you think about how we're thinking about scaling, we're not thinking about like one single investment, right? We're normally thinking about multiple funds. So now we have over 10 funds that are micro funds. Some markets, for instance, like Latin America and Southeast Asia, we have launched more than 1 fund. Means like we're on fund 2. And a lot of sort of initiatives that we run, we think that in scalability. That's why when people ask us, like, how many companies you have invested? Like, it's 1,700, and it doesn't even feel that many. Maybe we'll do 500 funds. The third thing that is really important that I've learned, and I think that's the one that holds closest to my heart, is there's one really important thing I learned there, which is people believe it and the context. So there was this survey that came out. It's not related to startup, with the Jubilee project. If you had a chance, you should look at their video. The question is, if you could change one thing about your body, what would it be? Think about it for a second. If you could change one thing about your body, what would it be? So they collected 50 answers into that context. Some of them were people like us. Other were kids. The kids, I did a print screen on one of them. She said, if I can, I could have teletransportation in my body. And like, that is such a beautiful message, because we forget, we put our limitation based on what we see that is in front of us. Like, I want to change, I don't know, my hair, my whatever it is, right? But the kids were like, I want to grow like a tail. I want to have like a teletransportation. So the context is so important. So the context for the adults are different from the context for the children, right? The context for Silicon Valley is a different context from Paraguay. Context is different, but there's no difference between the talent and between the people. So one really important message: don't change your boobs or whatever you think you want to change the context. I was saying, like, one of the logo we had is like blowing startup since 2010. I'm wearing this t-shirt. It sort of speaks, this is actually a t-shirt that Ying, who is our designer, she designed about the diversity culture of us, and in very small fine print says, believe in your fucking self. And that is something that I feel that I really learned in my journey at 500. I wrote this blog post beginning of the year saying, like, finally my imposter syndrome has gone away. And a lot of it is that context that you put in your mind, right? People want to go to Silicon Valley, people want to like change things, but everything is in your mind. Everything is the context, and that we can change. So from the first picture, I think I was 1 year old, that was at my parents are very entrepreneurial, so they were trying to, of course, as a Chinese immigrant, have the store, to sort of being in Silicon Valley. And there's one thing that makes me really proud. I've done investments, and that's something that I'm really passionate about, because I feel the way 500 startups invest, and the reason I joined, it's because we can do it globally. We can take that Silicon Valley mindset, a way of investing, understanding failure, believing in the founders anywhere in the world. But I spend now most of my time thinking about how do we also transform the rest of the ecosystem, right? How, and particularly this lady, Pocket, she came to our first sort of Stanford program. She was very young, she's like early 20s, and she said, I want to invest in the millenniums. So we were like, sure, we'll believe in you, come join us. A year and a half after she was featured in the Forbes Asia, she was of course the only woman in the cover. But I think more important than whether people are in Forbes or not, she actually have invested since then about 30 companies. She raised her small fund, and it's been only a year and a half. So you will see and hear more from her. So the power that I feel like me believing in myself through 500 and then being able to provide that as a platform to the rest of the world, and really like sparkling a little bit of like the belief of the unicorns, the belief that you can make the change by just connecting. It's something that I spend my time doing, and I'm going to spend, I think, the rest of my life doing. Thank you very much.